Okay, hi everyone. So my name is Kelsey Wood and I'm a PhD candidate at UC Davis and I study plant microbe interactions. And I think that plants are incredibly intelligent. And that's not just because I'm a hippie, which I am, but I've really become convinced of plant intelligence after reading recent scientific papers that show plants know a lot more than we think they know. And I was actually inspired to give this talk when I saw this video, came out last year, of a plant lighting up with calcium-based signaling in response to wound healing. So before I got into plants, I did my undergraduate at Reed College and I studied animal behavior and neuroscience. And when I saw this video, I was blown away at how similar the way that this plant responded to a stimulus, how similar that was to how animal neurons respond to stimuli. So I did more research in the area of plant intelligence, and I'm excited to share what I found out with you today. So before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that this talk is being given on traditional Nisenan land, and my research takes place at UC Davis, which is built on traditional Patwin land. So before the gold rush, there were actually over 300,000 Native Americans in California. That number decreased to less than 17,000 due to smallpox and other illnesses and displacement from their homes. So I want to take a few seconds of silence to honor those Native Americans who lost their lives, their land, and their knowledge due to colonialism. Thank you. I'd also like to thank Nikki for inviting me to speak, and for my lab at UC Davis for supporting my research, to my friends and family, many of whom are out there today, for supporting my mental health and well-being. I couldn't have done it in graduate school without you. Okay, so on to plants and why they're so smart. So when I was doing research for this talk, I really wanted to actually see what the indigenous knowledge of plant intelligence already was and what may have been overlooked by scientists. And I found this book here by Robin Wall Kimmerer. Dr. Kimmerer is a professor of botany and she's a Native American. And in this book, she braids the two ways of looking at the world really sweetly in the book called Braiding Sweetgrass. And in the book, she says that plants have the ability to perceive, sense, respond to, and communicate about the environment. They create and maintain relationships with other beings. They adjust their behavior in ways that benefit survival and reproduction. And in her mind, this is evidence of intelligence. And she talks a lot in her book about reconnecting with her traditional culture and learning the Potawatomi language. And she notices that verbs in that language are conjugated differently depending on whether the subject is animate or inanimate. As you might imagine, in that language, plants are animate objects. Plants are people. And this type of grammar presumes an intelligence of plants that I think science is just now barely starting to grasp. So, if plants are people, what would it be like to be a plant? Some of the volunteers experienced that today in some way. And so I studied animal behavior, and there's a concept in that field called Umwelt. And that's a German word that translates to the world around, or like the environment. And the idea is that each organism experiences the world completely different from us or any other organism. And this is because each organism has different senses that are adapted to what's important to them. For example, dogs can smell hundreds and thousands more chemicals than we can smell, and a dog's Umwelt is largely based in the world of smell. Another important idea of Umwelt, which actually draws from Kant, is the idea that it's impossible to grasp knowledge of the world beyond our senses, which really makes it hard to imagine the world from another organism's perspective. We can try, but it's a lot like putting googly eyes on a flower. But we're going to try anyways in this talk. But first I want to read a quote from Robin Wall Kimmerer's book again, which I think puts the problem of being locked into our own Umwelt into perspective. She says this on the topic of plant communication. In the old times, our elders say, the trees talked to one another, but scientists decided long ago that plants were deaf and mute, locked in isolation without communication. The possibility of conversation was summarily dismissed. Science pretends to be purely rational, completely neutral, a system of knowledge-making in which the observation is independent of the observer. And yet the conclusion was drawn that plants cannot communicate because they lack the mechanisms that animals use to speak. The potentials for plants were seen purely through the lens of animal capacity, until quite recently, no one seriously explored the possibilities that plants might speak to one another, which they do, and which I'm going to talk about. So, part of the reason I think we don't see plants the same way is they live on a completely different time scale than us. Here are a couple time lapses. I have a bean seed germinating, a sunflower tracking the sun, a beanstalk climbing, and a carnivorous plant eating a fly. And I think when these plant behaviors are sped up, we can see that plants are just as active as any animal. I also have a plant here that's naturally sped up. This is a sensitive plant. I don't know if you guys were poking it or not, but right now it's all closed up. So this plant, when you touch its leaves, will close up in response to that. You can come look at it later, maybe when it opens up. And actually this plant has recently been suggested that it's capable of learning, so it can learn to ignore a stimulus such as touching if it decides it's not harmful to it. So it's very interesting. All right, what do plants sense? Plants can sense light. I don't know why that hand's back. So plants have eyes. They can sense different wavelengths of light. They can sense touch, like the sensitive plant, and most other plants too, and too much touch can actually be harmful to plants. It can cause them to die. They can detect vibrations, so they have ears. They can sense chemicals, in analogy to our taste or smell. They can sense gravity. They know which direction to grow. They can track time using circadian clocks. They can sense nutrients and grow in those directions. They can sense water, and they can also sense microbes. And there are thousands and thousands of chemicals that plants use to communicate with and that they sense and respond to. But one of the most important ones is methyl jasmonate. And actually, I was going to pass out these jasmine flowers. So, could someone come up here? Yeah, there's like 4 of them. So take a jasmine flower and smell it. It's really nice. Pass it on. So one of the main chemicals that you're smelling here, depicted over there, it's methyl jasmonate. And this is a compound that when plants are wounded, they release into the air, and that activates the defense responses in the plant and also warns neighboring plants that there are insects around and makes them more resistant. And this kind of demonstrates that chemistry is the primary language of plants. So they release a ton of chemicals into the air to warn neighboring plants, and they also release chemicals in the air to recruit insects, like wasps, to help fight their attackers for them. In fact, the smell of fresh cut grass is actually the grass screaming for help from insects to come protected. In addition to the above ground parts of the plants, the roots are also involved in communication, primarily with microbes. So the roots actually secrete a ton of chemicals to attract microbes in and to feed beneficial bacteria and fungi. So plants do communicate underground. They have their own version of the internet. In forests, there's something called the mycorrhizal network, which basically just means fungus root network. The mushrooms that we see when we're walking through the forest are only the fruiting body of the fungus. Most of the fungus is underground. The underground portion is called the mycelium, and it connects neighboring trees to each other. And trees can use this network to communicate signals about pests. They can also transfer carbon and other nutrients to neighbors in need through the fungal networks. So plants have Venmo. Plants can actually remember infections, and they can communicate with themselves. One example of this is during infections by pathogens, which are harmful microbes. The plants release a signal to the rest of the plant to prime the defense response. And this signal is mediated by salicylic acid, which you might know as aspirin, and which was also isolated from the bark of the willow tree by a lot of Native Americans and used as a painkiller. And just like aspirin helps sick people, it can help sick plants. In fact, agricultural companies have used this molecule to create plants with their defenses primed, which are more disease resistant. So plants also respond to animal predators. So the primary hormone involved here is jasmonic acid, which is the smell of jasmine, hopefully, which you've all smelled by now. But recently, scientists have shown another important part of this signaling, which is calcium spikes. So here. So here are a video. Maybe? I don't know. Oh yeah. Yeah. All right. So yeah, you have a caterpillar munching on a leaf, and you can see that in this plant they basically took a green fluorescent protein from jellyfish, and they combined it with a calcium sensor so that the scientists could monitor the calcium levels, and it glows green. And as soon as the caterpillar starts to munch on the leaf, the whole plant lights up. The whole plant knows it's under attack. And it spreads to the plant via the phloem, which is basically like the plant's bloodstream. Plants also use neurotransmitters. So the caterpillar research came out of Simon Gilroy's lab at University of Wisconsin-Madison. And in the same paper, they show that if you apply a little bit of glutamate to the leaf, that glutamate can trigger the calcium spiking. And you might know about glutamate from MSG, monosodium glutamate. It's a savory seasoning, umami, very delicious. It's an amino acid, and it's also an excitatory neurotransmitter. It can excite neurons in animals. And just like in animals, these plants need the glutamate receptor in order to be excited. Since in this paper they showed that plants that are mutated for the receptor did not show a calcium response. And also, as a side note, plants also make other neurotransmitters such as melatonin, serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, but their role in plant physiology is not yet understood, so it could be really interesting. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about how plants sense and respond to microbes. So this happens primarily at the cellular level. And here I have an illustration of a human toll-like receptor, which recognizes microbes in human cells. And I show this picture in my talk about plants because the structure of the plant receptors are exactly the same. These receptors are proteins which bind like lock and key to microbial features such as the fungal cell wall. And since they are proteins, they're genetically encoded. So it can be said that plants have a genetic immune system. They do not have antibodies like humans. So all of the plant's immune system has to be passed down from the parents to the offspring. And there are a lot of pathogens out there. So it's not a surprise that plants have a lot of these proteins, on the order of 500 or more genes encoding for these receptors that decorate the cell membrane around the cell. And these receptor proteins can be thought of as like the sentinels of the cell. So they look out for invaders, and when they spot them, they send a signal to the nucleus, which is like the HQ of the cell, and telling it to respond. And I have a nice illustration of that. So here I have a hypothetical fungus infecting a plant cell, and here's the little sentinel protein sending a message to the nucleus. And it turns out pathogens have some tricks up their sleeves here. So the fungus is going to try to stop this process basically by shooting the messengers. That's these guys here. So it'll secrete these little proteins into the plant cell, and they're going to block those messengers, and so the plant doesn't know that it's under attack, and that way the infection can continue. However, plants have evolved another mechanism to sense the pathogens, which is the detection of these little assassins. And so they have intracellular sentinels that are similar in structure to those in the membrane, but they detect the pathogen proteins directly and trigger an immune response of their own. Unsurprisingly, pathogens have evolved ways to stop these intracellular sentinels, and it's basically a molecular arms race, or a Cold War. And because of this, plants are always mutating their sequences to try to recognize the pathogens. Pathogens are mutating theirs to not be detected, and it's kind of like the Red Queen in Alice in Wonderland, where you basically have to keep running and running just to stay in the same place. You evolve or you die. Alright, this is iceberg lettuce. Iceberg lettuce does not grow in the wild. It was domesticated from a weed thousands of years ago, and now it's coddled on farms all throughout the world. If you think about its wild relatives, which are still around, by the way, they face much greater evolutionary pressure to recognize pathogens because they're out there on their own, and so they're better adapted to those pathogens. Also, during the process of domestication to make a delicious iceberg lettuce, people primarily focused on yield and flavor, I guess, and some of the genes for disease resistance might have been lost along the way. So plant breeders right now, including those at UC Davis and those in my lab, are looking at ways to bring the wild genes back into the plants for greater disease resistance. So I actually didn't see salad on the menu, but maybe you've had a salad in the last week, and that's great. But have you ever thought about what could be lurking in your salad? Hopefully it's not downy mildew. But if you do find any downy mildew, please save a sample of it for me so I can analyze it in the lab. So I study lettuce, and one of the reasons I study lettuce is because there's a lot of money in lettuce. So over $3 billion is generated every year in California alone in lettuce. Almost all the U.S.'s lettuce is grown in Salinas Valley, a salad bowl of the world. So Salinas has cool temperatures, which lettuce loves. Unfortunately, it's also the perfect conditions for downy mildew, a fungus-like organism and the most devastating disease on lettuce. So currently, over half of the fungicides are applied specifically just to target downy mildew, and there's actually no effective organic control. They've also found recently that if your lettuce is infected with downy mildew, you're going to have more E. coli on it. So there's implications for human health as well. So we know that genetic resistance. Oh, you have a question?
Is downy mildew a generalist or a specialist?
Specialist, super specialist. It only affects lettuce. But every plant species has its own downy mildew. Yeah. But they don't interbreed at all. Alright, so genetic resistance is a lot more effective than using fungicides and more sustainable as well. So we decided to go wild. Here I have a picture of Lactuca virosa, also known as opium lettuce. It's called that because it actually has analgesic properties that have used for centuries as an alternative to opium. So it doesn't look very appetizing. And I used to always say at talks that it tastes disgusting, but I actually had some before this talk, and it's not that bad. And I'm feeling great. So anyway, it's really resistant to downy mildew. So we wondered, how many pathogen proteins does this wild lettuce recognize? And also, how durable is the resistance? In other words, how easy would it be for the pathogen to outsmart it? And what we found, in short, this is like a lot of my thesis, but I'm condensed into one slide. We found that this lettuce is very clever indeed. So we made a cross between our cultivated lettuce and the wild lettuce and did some genetic mapping and basically found out that it recognizes 7 proteins from the downy mildew. And all these recognitions are genetically linked, so that means they're going to get inherited as a single unit on the chromosome, which is great for breeding because you won't lose that throughout the generations. It's what's known as a natural gene stack. So it should offer more durable resistance in theory because the pathogen would have to mutate all 7 of its proteins in order to overcome this resistance, which is just not very likely statistically. So I hope that one day we will be growing this lettuce in California and we will be able to reduce pesticides and increase yields. You have a question?
Yeah. Are the proteins in the downy mildew near each other?
No.
Thank you.
The proteins in the downy mildew have nothing in common. They're all distinct proteins.
Excellent.
Yeah?
Is this gene family all distinct from each other, or are they like homologs of each other?
I'm guessing they're going to be homologs, but we don't know yet. That's what I'm working on right now.
So it could have been like gene duplication or something?
Yeah, gene duplication happens a lot for these receptors that recognize plant or pathogen proteins. But the thing is, the pathogen proteins have nothing in common, so it's very curious. We might have just hit the jackpot. We'll find out. In conclusion, so plants they don't actually have a brain. They lack a central nervous system, but they are smart. They are able to sense and respond to their environment. They are able to communicate with other plants, fungi, and insects. They have behavior and show signs of intelligence. And wild plants are especially smart since they are adapted to their pathogens, and they can help us breed disease-resistant crops. Finally, I'd like to end with a quote from Michael Pollan, who has a really great TED Talk on looking at the plant's eye view. And he thinks that if we look at the world from another species' point of view, that is a cure for the disease of human self-importance. And I think that in a lot of ways, it's impossible to see the world through the eyes of a plant because we're so limited by our own senses. But I think that if we try, it may change the way we interact with our environment, with our plants, and with our food. That's all I got. Thank you.